Have you ever imagined something so dark that even logic can't explain? That night in Mont Sombre, I discovered that some legends are not just stories, and what I found out there changed my life forever. The ghost patients. I have been a nurse for almost 8 years, and most of that time was in a small hospital, one that everyone knows by name, and where gossip runs faster than the morning shift. I never thought I would tell you something like that, but I need to share what happened with me, even if some do not believe it. It all started about 4 months ago when I noticed something strange happening in the palliative care sector. It wasn't something that I could explain right away, but it was like an instinct, you know. I began to realize that the terminally ill patients were dying in a way too predictable. I know it sounds absurd because that's what happens to terminally ill patients, but the issue was not whether they died, but how and when. All who passed through that sector died within 2 days. Always. At first, I tried to rationalize. Working with people so sick it gets in our heads makes us imagine things. But the more I saw, the harder it would be to ignore. The stories matched exactly. A patient was admitted with a terminal illness, was hospitalized in the specific ward, and 2 days later died. Always in the middle of the morning, between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. The worst is that each patient's conditions were different, but the causes of death were almost always recorded as multiple organ failure. I know, coach, it makes sense, but it seems so mechanical, so repetitive, that I started to feel like something was out of place. That's when I decided to look at the charts more carefully, and then everything started to fall apart. I started comparing the old charts with the new ones, just out of curiosity at first, but soon noticed something that made me shiver. There were small changes in the records, as if someone was manipulating information. They were subtle things, data that made no sense, a detail about a drug that was never administered, or even changes in the order of events and treatments. At first, I thought it was a registration error. It happens, especially in a hospital with few resources and overworked staff. But the frequency of these coincidences was what bothered me most. I checked each line in the charts and got that feeling that someone was cheating on something they shouldn't. The worst was when I noticed that patients who passed through this specific ward were almost always referred by the same doctor. Dr. Gustavo was one of the most experienced doctors in the hospital, and everyone trusted him. He was the kind of person who knew how to win anyone's trust, with that calm manner and low voice, always giving elaborate explanations to families. But I began to notice that he had a strange habit of being very insistent in referring patients to that ward, even when it did not seem necessary. He said things like to ensure comfort or monitor more closely, but something didn't fit. It wasn't just my paranoia. I felt there was a pattern, even if I couldn't prove it yet. Decide to go deeper, but know that you must be discreet. Dr. Gustavo had a lot of influence in the hospital, and if anyone knew I was cheating on those records outside my shift, I could lose my job or worse, be reported for violating protocols. During one of the quietest nights, I took advantage of a moment when no one was around and entered the digital files room. I knew what to look for, the autopsy reports, and that's when it all got even weirder. Some patients did not even have a recorded post-mortem examination, which in terminal cases was required by protocol. Other reports had rather vague, partially published reports. It was as if someone was erasing traces or just pretending that the procedures had been done. That night, I left the hospital with my heart pounding. I can't sleep. I started to wonder if I was exaggerating, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. The next day, I caught watching Dr. Gustavo more closely. I noticed the times he left the ward and the time he spent in the office before releasing patients or registering deaths. It was during this discreet surveillance that I discovered something terrifying. He always carried a small blue folder to the palliative room, as if he was carrying documents or something related to treatment. So far, nothing too much, but that night in particular, I saw something that made no sense. He left the room without the briefcase. Intrigued, I took advantage of a distraction on the team to take a quick look at the room where he was. When I entered the room, the atmosphere seemed different. It was as if the air was heavier, dense in a difficult way to explain. I knew I only had a few minutes before someone noticed my absence, so I started looking for anything that caught their attention. In the corner, near the bed, I found a blue folder that Dr. Gustavo always carried. It was partially open, and my heart popped when I saw that it did not contain medical documents or forms but syringes. Some still sealed, others clearly used. My stomach turned on the spot. I knew something was wrong, but had no idea what exactly. I put on gloves quickly, and with trembling hands opened the entire folder. My head started to spin. I knew I couldn't stand there for long, but I couldn't stop looking at the notes. There was a list of over 20 names, many of whom I recognized as recently deceased patients. Everything indicated that it was a scam, something involving the terminally ill patients at that time, and, from what it looked like, some kind of financial gain. But what? Organ sales? Experimental drugs? I have no idea, but I need to get out of there. Closed the folder, put it back in place, and left the room trying to look calm, although my heart was about to explode. When I returned to the nursing post, my legs barely supported me. I knew that if I remained quiet, I would be an accomplice to something monstrous, but how to report this without sufficient evidence? And what would Dr. Gustavo do if he found out I knew? The next morning, I was assigned to face Dr. Gustavo, but not directly. I wanted to see how he would react if I mentioned some of the things they had noticed. I waited until the end of my shift, when he was alone in the office. I came in with some pretext. I clarified something about a patient, and, trying to keep my voice steady, I started asking subtle questions about recent deaths. I noticed that so many patients had the same pattern of death and mentioned that some families commented on the speed of deaths. He stared at me, not blinking, for a second too long, before I answered with that calm and rehearsed tone of always. These things happen. We do the best we can, but sometimes there's not much to do. But it was the way he spoke, as if he was already waiting for someone to ask. I felt a little stronger and decided to tighten a bit more. He mentioned, casually, that he was reviewing some medical records and that he had noticed some inconsistencies in the records. It seemed to really bother him. He frowned and tilted his head slightly, as if trying to measure as far as I could see. Inconsistencies? Maybe there are some error in the system. You know how it is. This happens all the time. But at that moment I was sure he was nervous. He started to move the pen on the table, spinning between his fingers. Before I could say anything else, he came forward and with a requested smile said that I needed to solve something urgent. I watched him go out, and that cold smile was etched in my mind. It was a smile that said, "I know you know, but you're not going to do anything about it." That night, I could not get out of my head the conversation with the doctor. "Gustavo, I have decided that I need more evidence before I take anything to the administration or the police." It was not only a matter of fear, though I was terrified, but also because I knew that no one would believe me without concrete evidence. I spent hours going through files in the hospital system, and the more I looked, the more strange things appeared. There were financial records controlled to the names of patients, as if there were payments received soon after each death. The amounts were too high to appear as simple insurance or medical expenses. Also, I found references to a company whose name I had never heard of. It looked like some kind of private medical organization, but the name sounded more like a front. While I was trying to put the pieces together, I got a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number and said only, "Stop messing where you shouldn't." My blood froze. I had not spoken to anyone about what I was doing, and that could only mean that Dr. Gustavo or someone connected with him knew I was investigating. There was no turning back now. I decided that the next morning I would go to the police with everything I had found, even if it wasn't enough. But something stopped me. During the early morning, the whole hospital was evacuated due to a chemical leak in one of the laboratories. All computers have been turned off and access to files has been blocked. When I tried to go back and get some of the notes that I had hidden, I found that the entire sector was closed and the physical folders were discovered missing. It was as if everything had been cleaned out from one moment to another. The silent tenants. I always liked the idea of living alone, having my own space, my own rules. So when I got an apartment with rent within my budget, I didn't think twice. It was an old building with narrow corridors and elevators that made strange noises, but the price was good and the location was even better. At first, everything seemed normal. The apartment was small but cozy. There were some marks on the walls and that strange smell of a closed place, but nothing that a good cleaning would not solve. My biggest annoyance was the ventilation system. There were large pipes that cut through the apartment, and I could clearly hear the sounds coming from other apartments. Sometimes it was muffled conversations, sometimes laughter, and other times, well, things that made me turn the TV to maximum volume, only not to pay attention. On the third night I spent there, I discovered something different. It was no longer the casual sound of neighbors living their lives. It was low, almost imperceptible but repetitive. Like a drag, a suggestion that seemed to echo through the ventilation ducts of my room. At first, I thought it was paranoia, maybe my head playing tricks because of the absolute silence of the night. But the continuous sound, night after night, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. It seemed to come from the top floor or maybe from the side. It was hard to say. What bothered me the most was that every time I got up to try to find out the origin, the children stopped. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. After all, living in an old building means that strange noises are part of the package. At least that's what I said to myself. After a few nights trying to ignore the children, I decided to investigate further. I went to the front door to talk with the manager, an older man named Mr. Morrow. He was the kind who always seemed busy, walking around with a set of keys in his hand. When I mentioned the noises, he uttered a small laugh and said that the ducts were old and sometimes made noise because of the expansion of the metal or the wind. The explanation seemed plausible, but his carefree manner made me uncomfortable. I couldn't explain, but there was something about the way he looked away while talking that left me with a strange feeling, as if he knew something and didn't want to tell me. Leave there more restless than before. That night, the children grew more intense. It was as if something was being dragged through the ducts. I could swear that I heard something that sounded like steps, but it was impossible, right? Who could walk inside a ventilation duct? I tried to record the sound with my phone, but for some reason, the noise did not come out in the recording, only the silence of the night. I stayed up late, with a mixture of fear and curiosity. At about 3 a.m. the noise stopped abruptly. I took advantage of the silence to try to sleep, but before you can relax, I heard a different sound. It was low but clear. A laugh. There were no joyful moments, but short, dry, as if someone had heard me and was enjoying my fear. It was then that he realized that something very wrong was happening. The next morning, I went to the neighboring apartment, where I thought the children might be coming from. I knocked on the door a few times, but nobody answered. It wasn't that weird, maybe I found out at work or something. However, what made me uncomfortable was to realize that the corridor was cold, more than normal. As if the air conditioning of the building was turned on at maximum, but there were no systems like this in the building, only old fans. I decided to take a quick look at the other floors, and that's when I noticed something else strange. Many apartments were simply unoccupied. No TV sound, no lights on, no movement. For a building that, according to the manager, was almost crowded, it did not make sense. I mentally wrote down the numbers of doors that were reasonably abandoned and returned to my apartment, trying to rationalize all this. That night, the noises started earlier, just before midnight. This time, there seemed to be more than one sound. It was as if someone was scratching the ducts or dragging something heavy. I tried to ignore it, but it did not work. Took a flashlight and went to the air outlet of my room, where the sound seemed stronger. I drew my ear and for a moment, I could hear voices. It was not possible to distinguish words, but they were whispered, as if several people spoke at the same time very quietly. My heart popped, and I immediately walked away. I was paralyzed in the middle of the room, holding the flashlight, trying to decide whether I would call someone or just run away. It was then that I felt something that froze me to the bones. The air that came out of the ducts was hot, very hot, as if someone had just breathed in there. I could hardly sleep that night. As soon as it was light, I went straight to the city library. I had to find out something about that building, anything that would explain what was going on. I spent hours sifting through old files and finally found an article that talked about the place. The building had been built in the 1950s and for a long time was used as a kind of pension for single workers. However, what caught my attention was a series of disappearances in the 1980s. The article mentioned at least 5 people who disappeared without trace while living there. The investigation never reached any conclusion, and the case was dismissed. What is the most bizarre detail? 2 of the names listed in the article matched the names I had seen on the mailbox phones that were now abandoned. When I returned to the building, my head was a million. I went straight up to my apartment, but something stopped me in the hallway. The door of one of the apartments that I was sure was empty was ajar. I was frozen for a moment, trying to decide whether to look away or simply ignore. Curiosity won. I pushed the door slowly and came across a completely empty room, with no furniture, without anything that indicated that someone lived there. But the ground was covered with marks, like deep scratches made by something heavy being dragged. Before I could explore further, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw Mr. Morrow standing in the corridor, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "This apartment is closed," he said, his voice firm. I apologized and went back to my room, but I couldn't take his look out of my head. It was almost like a warning. I knew I couldn't ignore it. That night, I decided that I really understood where the children came from and and what was really going on. I took a screwdriver and removed the note from the vent in my room. The space was narrow, but it seemed possible to squeeze inside. With a flashlight and my heart pounding, I leaned down and looked inside. It was dark, and the smell was strange, metallic, almost like dry blood mixed with old dust. I thought I saw something moving in the background, but I convinced myself that it was my mind playing tricks. Before you could decide what to do, I heard a noise coming from the corridor. I turned off my flashlight and waited in silence. It was as if someone was walking slowly, dragging his feet. I cannot explain why, but I had the feeling that it was not Mr. Morrow. Something doesn't seem strange, wrong. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the door to my apartment open. I was absolutely sure it was locked. I hid behind the bed, still holding a flashlight. The light from the hallway was leaking out of the bedroom door, but I couldn't see who or what was there. I heard footsteps coming, slow, as if the person was deliberately trying to scare me. And then he stopped. The silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heart beating. It was when I realized the sound of the duct had started again. But it was no longer a distant sound. It was something moving fast, coming towards me. Before I could react, I felt a blow in the air, as if someone had run through the room, but there was no one there. When I finally had the courage to light the lantern, the door of my apartment was locked again, as if nothing had happened. The abandoned office. I have been working as a night security for some years, but I confess that I always felt more comfortable in more busy jobs, such as malls or factories. Recently, I was moved to an office building that was partially abandoned. When I say partially, it is because some floors were still used during the day by small businesses, but most of the building was empty. My shift started at 10 p.m., and my job was basically to monitor the security cameras, do hourly rounds, and make sure no one broke into the place. At first, it seemed like the dream job. Little movement, absolute silence, and most nights I spent time reading or watching something on my phone. But, right from the first week, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Small details, like lights on floors that should be unoccupied or doors I was sure to have locked, appearing unlocked in the next round. What left me most puzzled was the record book in the doorway. Every shift, I was obliged to write down the time of the rounds and any activity that happened in the building. One night, while I was flipping through the pages to review old entries, I noticed something that made me shiver. There were records of visits during my shift, names, check-in and check-out times that I had never done. They were written in my handwriting, but I didn't remember having them written down. And the strangest thing, the schedules made no sense. Some of these entrances appeared recorded in the same place where I knew I was on the other side of the building, making rounds or watching the cameras. I was looking at those notes for a good few minutes, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I forgot or made some mistake, but deep down something didn't feel right. After noticing the strange records, I decided to be more attentive. In the following nights, I began to monitor security guards more carefully. It was an old system with black and white images and poor quality, but you could see the basics. On the third night of this investigation, I saw something that made me uneasy. At about 2 a.m., one of the cameras on the 12th floor, which should be completely unoccupied, recorded a movement. It looked like a shadow across the corridor, but when I went back to check the tape, there was nothing. I knew I wasn't imagining. I started to walk through the empty floors during my rounds, but I didn't find anything out of place except for one thing. The 12th floor had a strange smell, something chemical, kind of metallic, that didn't seem to come from a normal office. I tried not to think about it too much and convinced myself that it could be something old or some forgotten product. The next night was when everything started to get out of control. During a midnight round, while checking the upper floors, I heard a sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. They were not fast steps, but steady, constant, as if someone was walking carefully. The problem was that I knew there was no one there. My radio was off, and the lights in the hall were out. I froze for a moment, trying to listen more carefully, but the steps stopped. I decided to go ahead, but to end the round soon than for courage. When I passed by the room on the 12th floor, that with the strange smell dash, I noticed that the door, which I was absolutely sure to have locked before, was half open. For a moment, I thought about calling the security station or the police, but instead I made the worst possible choice. I went in to check. Inside the room, the smell was even stronger, almost suffocating. It was a mixture of something chemical with an odor that I could only describe as rust. There was not much in the space, only some old tables, stacked chairs, and a kind of metal cabinet in the corner. What caught my attention was a weak light blinking under one of the tables. When I lowered myself to see better, I found a strange electronic device, something like a recorder or a camera, stuck with tape at the bottom of the table. It didn't seem like something left by chance. I reached out to pick it up, but before I could touch it, I heard a noise coming from the corridor. It was like the sound of a door being closed with force, followed by quick steps that echoed in silence. I got up so fast that I almost knocked the table over and ran to the entrance of the room. But when I looked at the corridor, it was empty. My instinct told me to leave the building, but for some reason I decided to go back to the room and investigate the metal cabinet. It was heavy, and the doors were rusty, but I managed to open it with effort. Inside, I found cardboard boxes full of folders and documents. I didn't have time to look carefully, but one particular folder caught my attention because it was marked with the word confidential in red letters. When I opened, I saw a list of names and addresses, along with a series of data and what was no longer cash values. While I was leafing through the papers, I heard the sound of steps again, only this time they stopped right at the entrance to the room. My heart seemed to be stuck out of my mouth. I was completely still, with the paste in my hands, listening to someone's breath outside. Then the lights on the floor blinked and went out for good. I was in the dark, only with a flashlight that carried on my belt. I turned on the light, but hesitated to point at the door. Part of me didn't want to know who or what was standing there. For a few seconds, the silence was so dense that it seemed even my breath echoed. When I finally cried out for courage to turn the lantern to the entrance, there was no one. Only that something seemed different. The door, which was open before, was now closed. I was taken by a horrible feeling that someone was playing with me. I closed the door quickly, put it under my arm, and left the room as fast as I could. As I walked down the corridor toward the stairs, the metallic smell seemed to intensify, and my stomach began to stir. Then I heard the steps again. Only this time, they were behind me, approaching. I almost ran down the stairs, my heart beating. When I finally got to the ground floor, I went straight to the monitoring room, closed the door and locked, trying to catch my breath. I turned on the cameras to check the 12th floor, but all the images were static, as if there was some interference. I tried to adjust, but nothing worked. The only camera that still showed anything was the one in the hall downstairs, and it was there that I saw. A figure passed quickly through the entrance of the building, walking towards the stairs. I could not distinguish a face, only a tall and thin silhouette. I stood there, not knowing what to do, until the radio in my belt started emitting a static sound. The noise was so loud that I almost threw the device away. When I finally turned it off, a voice whispered from the other side, "You shouldn't be here." That voice was the last straw. I grabbed my folder and ran out of the building. Did not look back, did not want to know if that figure or anything else was following me. My only goal was to get out of there. When I finally reached the street, the feeling of rupture was immediate, but lasted a while. My car was parked a few meters away, but when I got close, I saw something on the windshield. It was a folded piece of paper, stuck by the wiper. With tremendous hands, I picked up and opened. The message was written in big red letters, "Stop now." There was no signature, but it confirmed what I already had. Someone knew what I had found and wanted to silence me. I threw the paper on the floor and got in the car. I drove straight home, trying to organize my thoughts and decide what to do next. When I got home, I sat on the couch with the folder in hand. I wanted to see more details of what I had found, but at the same time I was afraid to know how far it went. Finally, I opened the folder and started to examine the documents calmly. I found that the operations in the building involved something much bigger than I had imagined. It looked like a money laundering scheme and secret information trafficking involving companies and important figures of the city. There were even receipts for payments to specific people, with names I knew from local news. What scared me the most was a document at the bottom of the folder, a kind of threat list. My name was there. To this day, I don't know how they knew so much about me or why they chose that moment to act. The next morning, I gave everything anonymously to a local journalist. Since then, I don't work as a security anymore, but that building still appears in my nightmares. The missing sister. I was never close to my younger sister, not for lack of love, but because life took us in a way that seemed irreversible. She stayed in the small town where we grew up, while I moved to the capital, seeking to grow in the career of journalism. Our contact was limited to sporadic messages and occasional video calls, always full of a polite but distant tone. So when I got a call from the local police saying that Vanessa had been missing for almost a week, I was paralyzed. The officer's voice on the other side seemed calm but direct. "She has not been seen since last Wednesday. We know you're not that close, but we think maybe you can help." That's like a disguised distress call. Without thinking too much, I took the car and returned to that city that I had sworn never to step. I arrived at her house in the middle of the afternoon. The place seemed as empty as the feeling that was growing inside me. There was no sign of forced entry, and everything was in place, almost too clean. Apparently, she left home as she would on any other day, but never came back. I looked at her phone, which the police had left on the desk, and started to search. The last messages showed nothing out of the ordinary except for a short sequence of texts to someone called M. The messages were vague, but there was something in them that bothered me. "I'm still not thinking about what you said. I think I can go there tomorrow." There were no answers, and the name or number behind the M was not saved. It was a starting point, but deep down something told me that the situation was much more complicated than it seemed. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to find something that linked Vanessa to this M. I called some of the few friends she still had in town, but nobody seemed to know anything. They said the obvious: she was reserved. She worked too much and did not leave home much. This image of my sister as a lonely person made me sick. After searching the house and finding nothing useful, he decides to go to a police station to speak directly with the investigator. There, one of the officers presented something that was not in the initial reports. A witness said she saw Vanessa near the old Rising Sun motel the last time she was seen. This immediately caught my attention. The motel had been abandoned for years, since the original owner disappeared, and it was the kind of place that everyone avoided, more out of superstition than anything else. I decided to go there, even though it was not a more sensible choice. I arrived at the motel almost dark. The facade was even more decadent than I remembered. Broken windows, rusty plates, and the absolute silence of the place made me question my sanity for being there alone. The entrance gate was open, and there were tire marks on the ground, as if someone had been there recently. With the phone in hand to record everything, I started exploring the place. The outer corridors were empty, but there was something in the rooms, locked doors that were impossible to open. Until we arrived at room 7. The door was just leaning, and when I pushed it, the smell of mold and something stronger, almost metallic, took over the air. In the center of the room, there was a rolled-up carpet. For a second I hesitated. It was as if everything inside me screamed out, but I ignored and approached. With my heart beating, I knelt down on the side of the carpet. The thing was heavy, and the old fabric seemed stuck to the floor. When I started unrolling it, I noticed dark spots that were becoming more visible as the fabric loosened. It was dry blood, but still left a strong smell in the air. My stomach rapped, and a part of me wanted to stop, but something told me I had to keep going. At the end of the carpet, there was a crumpled photo. Carefully picked it up, trying not to let my hands shake too much. It was a picture of Vanessa, but it looked old, taken before we saved ourselves. The strange was what was written on the back. She knew too much. At that moment, my mind began to run in 1,000 searches. Who had left it there? And what did my sister know could lead to something like that? I left the room in a hurry, feeling that the place was suffocating. My plan was to go straight to the car and give everything to the police, but as I walked down the hall, something caught my attention. A door further ahead was half open, and there was light coming out of it. It wasn't a strong light, but like the glow of a lantern. Held my phone tightly and approached slowly, trying not to make noise. When I peeked out the front of the door, I saw a table full of papers scattered and an open laptop. The screen showed photos of several women, including Vanessa, and beside each image there were notes and data. What I thought about completely was realizing that many of those dates ended with a red X. My gut said that was not a good sign. Before I could analyze what I was selling, I heard footsteps approaching the corridor. My body completely jammed when I heard the footsteps. They were not fast, but steady and constant, echoing in the empty corridor. I looked back at the room, at the table full of papers, and knew that I did not have much time. In a rush, I took one of the sheets that seemed most relevant, a list of names and addresses, and slipped it into my coat pocket. My heart seemed to pound in my ears as I lowered myself to turn off the laptop, but before I could do anything, the light in the hallway went out. I was still trying to control my breath. The silence was so dense that it seemed like the whole building was watching me. Then a low, drawn voice came from somewhere in the dark. "You should not be here." I can't explain what happened inside me, but an adrenaline rush took over and I ran to the exit without looking back. When I got outside, the fresh air was like a punch in the face. Everything seemed darker than before, and I could not get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around and saw that my car was exactly where I left it, but as I approached, I noticed something on the hood. It was a brown envelope, taped to the inside. My hands trembled as I took it off and opened it. Inside, there was only a short message written in big, hasty letters. "She's gone. You're next." My mind panicked. How did someone know I was there? And how had he put it in my car without me seeing? Turned on the car so fast that I almost hit the exit of the parking lot. As I drove back to the city, I tried to put my thoughts in order, but it was impossible. Everything seemed to be falling apart in a matter of minutes. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows before even taking off my coat. My body was exhausted, but my mind was on full alert. I took the sheet that I had taken from the motel and put it on the kitchen table. It was a list of names, many of them with addresses written on the side. I recognized some surnames. They were missing women from the area, including my sister. There was also data next to each name, but some were risky with that same red X I had seen on the laptop. Didn't know exactly what it wanted, but was sure that it was a sign of something terrible. I started taking pictures of the sheet with my phone. We recommend sending everything anonymously to a local journalist that I know. While doing this, I noticed that one of the addresses on the list was familiar. It was the house of the motel owner, a man named Alberto, who I vaguely remembered the stories that ran through the city when I was younger. Something told me I needed to check this place, but the fear of returning to that circle of terror paralyzed me. As I tried to decide what to do, my phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're thinking about what doesn't go away. Stop now. My heart is cold." It was impossible for anyone to know that I had that leaf. I had left it unseen, or at least found out that I did. I deleted the message quickly, but my mind was spinning. Decide I need to act fast before something happens to me. Took my things and drove to the police station. I explained what I knew, showed the sheet, and begged them to do something. The police promised to investigate, but the look of doubt on their faces left me with the feeling that they were not taking anything seriously. As I left the police station, I felt like something or someone was watching me, even in the middle of the busy street. That night, I could not sleep. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified. The noise of the wind in the window, the clatter of the wood floor, even the hum of the refrigerator. My mind kept thinking of what I had seen and what could happen next. I decided that I couldn't just wait for the police to act. I needed answers on my own. Got the address of the motel owner and left in the middle of the morning. The hidden place in a remote area, almost on the edge of the city, surrounded by tall trees that made everything even more gloomy. Upon arrival, I noticed that the house was completely off, except for a weak light in the basement. I stopped the car in the entrance and sat for a few minutes, trying to gather courage. Something inside me said I should not go in, but the despair for answers was stronger than fear. I went in through the back door, which was unlocked, as if they were waiting for me. The silence inside the house was almost palpable, and the metallic smell I felt in the motel was even stronger there. Followed the light of the basement, each step heavier than the previous one. When I went down the stairs, I saw a room full of files, photos, and maps. In the center, there was a wooden chair with some hooks on the arms. My heart almost stopped when I saw dark spots on the floor, which were mentioned recently. As I tried to analyze what I was selling, I heard footsteps upstairs. Ran out as fast as I could, without looking back, and got into the car, pulling away with tremendous hands. Since that night, I have not been back to the city, and I do not know what the police found, if they did investigate anything. All I know is that my sister was never found, and the motel owner a few days later. To this day, I have nightmares with that light in the basement and the footsteps echoing through the empty house. The camp monitor. I have been working as a monitor in summer camps for some years. I enjoy the outdoor environment, the activities with children, and most of the time, the spirit of camaraderie among colleagues. This last job, however, was different. Everything seemed normal at first. A secluded camp in the middle of the mountains, well-kept wooden huts, and a simple schedule focused on trails and games. I had been hired by recommendation of a friend, and although I did not know the entire team, I found everyone friendly during the first meeting. The owner, Mr. Elias, was an older man with a rigid but polite manner. He emphasized that safety was the #1 priority, which seemed reassuring. But already in the second week, a boy disappeared during a night walk, and that's when things started to get out of control. The boy, Nathan, was 11. He was in the group that I and another monitor, Lucas, were following on the trail. It was a quiet activity, with lanterns and frequent breaks to rest and watch the stars. At some point, as we returned to camp, I noticed that Nathan was not with the group. We stopped immediately to look for him. We called for him for almost half an hour, but we did not get any response. We informed Mr. Elias as soon as we arrived, and he's a specification for one search with the team. I remember thinking that we were fast and sure we will find the boy soon. But when it dawned, there was no sign of Nathan anywhere. Mr. Elias gathered us together and said that it was an unfortunate accident and that we should keep calm not to alarm the other children. It was at that moment that something inside me started to shout that there was something very wrong. Nathan's disappearance has moved me more than I would like to admit. During the day, as the camp activities went on as if nothing had happened, I could not stop thinking about how strange it was. The trail we made was simple, without dangerous areas or points where someone could simply disappear. Moreover, the fact that Mr. Elias to have dismissed the case as an accident made me uncomfortable. During a lunch break, I tried to talk with Lucas, the other monitor who was with me on the trail, but he seemed evasive. "Things happen," he said, looking at the plate as if he wanted to avoid the subject. I could not get anything more out of him, but I noticed that he was restless, almost nervous. Something in the answer made me feel that he knew more than he was saying. That night, I decided to investigate on my own. I waited until all the holidays came out with a flashlight to remake the trail we made on the night of disappearance. Everything was extremely quiet, and the feeling of being alone in the middle of the forest gave me shivers. I got to the point where I realized Nathan was missing and started looking for anything that might have gone unnoticed in the initial search. It was when I saw something shining in the light of the lantern, partially covered by leaves. It was a bracelet, one of those identification that all campers wore, with the name Nathan engraved on it. Took the object and felt my heart race. If the bracelet was there, it couldn't have gone very far, right? Before you can keep looking, step behind me. I turned the flashlight quickly, but saw no one. The sound stopped as soon as the light touched the bushes, but the feeling of being present with me. I went back to camp with Nathan's bracelet in my pocket, trying to make noise so as not to wake anyone up. When I entered my cabin, I found a folded note on the bed. There was no signature, just a short message written in hasty letters. "Stop looking." My first occurrence was shock. How did someone know I was on the trail? Who left the note and why? I spent the rest of the night awake, trying to understand what was going on. In the morning, I decided to show the bracelet to Mr. Elijah, thinking he might consider a new search. When I did, he just looked at me with an expression that I could not decipher. He took the bracelet, put it in his pocket, and said, with a cold tone, "This does not change anything. Continue with your tasks." That made me angry, but I realized that insisting only to put myself in a vulnerable position. Later that day, while I was organizing an activity with the children, I noticed two of the older monitors, Anna and Ricardo, talking in a low voice near the kitchen. They stopped immediately when they saw me, but not before I realized something was wrong. There was palpable tension in their faces, something that seemed more than just worry about Nathan's disappearance. We decided to follow them discreetly as we headed towards the supply depot. I waited outside by a window, trying to hear what they were saying. It was hard to get everything, but I heard Ricardo clearly say, "This has never happened so early before." He should have waited for the end of the season. My heart popped. Who was he? And what exactly should be expected? Before I could hear more, the storage door opened, and I hid behind a bush. They left in a hurry, looking around as if suspicious of something. After what I heard, I could not look at Anna and Ricardo the same way. I kept an eye on the two for the rest of the day, but they acted as if nothing had happened, laughing with the children and interacting with the other monitors. It was almost disturbing to see how they can mask the tension that they had shown before. Meanwhile, I kept trying to put the pieces together. I decided to go back to the lake that night, hoping to find something that would clarify what was going on. I waited until everything was quiet and walked there with my flashlight. When I entered, I was greeted by a strange smell, something metallic mixed with mold. I started to turn the boxes and shelves, looking for anything out of place. It was then that I found an old folder full of yellow documents and photos. What I saw made me freeze. There were old images of other camping groups, some dated decades ago. In several of them, there were notes on the back with names and data. Some of the names had a red X next to them, and among them was Nathan, 11 years old. I felt a shiver running through my body. He was not the first. Leafing through the folder, I found medical records and reports of disappearances that were never disclosed. My heart went wild when I realized that there was a pattern. Almost all the missing were under 12 years old, and their cases were always closed as accidents. Before I could analyze everything, I heard footsteps approaching from outside. I turned off a flashlight and hid behind a pile of boxes. The storage door was open and someone came in. I could hear the heavy breathing and slow steps, as if he knew there was someone there. I stood still, trying to control my breath as the footsteps echoed in the dark background. Whoever it was seemed to be searching the place, moving boxes and dropping heavy sighs. The sound of things being moved closer and closer, and I knew it was only a matter of time until I found them. My heart seemed about to explode. Suddenly, a person stopped right near where I was hiding, and the silence became unbearable. That's when I heard Richard's voice. "I know you're here. Better get out before things get worse for you." That threatening tone made me freeze, but also gave me a certainty. I was confused with something much bigger than I imagined. When he started to move away, I took the moment to leave through the back door and ran straight to my cabin. Locked the door and tried to organize the documents I was able to take with me. Everything pointed to Mr. Elias and a kind of bizarre scheme involving disappearances in the camp. But before I could think about the next step, I heard knocking on the door. It was Ricardo, accompanied by Anna, both with not friendly expressions. "We need to talk," he said, and at that moment, he realized they knew I knew too much. I jumped out the back window and ran to the car without looking back. Left the camp that night, driving without stopping until it was miles away. I never reported what I found. A part of me knew that they had enough influence to silence any attempt. To this day, I don't know what happened to Nathan or the other names on the list, but I do know that I barely survived, and never agreed to work in a summer camp again. The route of disappearance. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and in that time I've seen everything on the road. It's a lonely life, but if you like to drive and have the patience to spend hours watching the horizon until it is quiet. I was never the type that gets into other people's problems, but something that happened a few months ago still keeps me from sleeping. Was going to a warehouse in the countryside, on a remote road that was always considered strange. It was not only because it was deserted, but because every time I passed by there, it seemed that something was out of place. Plates of private property scattered on all sides, about high along kilometers, and no visible house. It was as if that whole region was hiding something. But on that particular night, what was just a bad feeling became the beginning of a nightmare. I was driving for about 4 hours without stopping and decided to pull up at a gas station to get a coffee and stretch my legs. The place was practically empty, only the driver half asleep and a parked car, which seemed to be there for days. That's when I saw a guy approaching my cabin. He was dirty, with torn clothes, and seemed terrified. "Please help me," he said in a trembling voice. I don't usually take a ride, but his condition left me with no choice. He got into the truck, and as soon as he closed the door, started talking without stopping, as if he had held it for a long time. Said he had escaped from a farm nearby, where they kept people against their will. He spoke of electric fences, armed guards, and even a shed where they said they selected who would stay and who would never be seen again. I didn't know what to think, but I could see in his eyes that he believed every word. While he was talking, I was trying to analyze everything. Remote farms were nothing new in that region, but what he described was completely different from anything I had ever heard. He said that he was taken along with others for forced labor, but some disappeared after being taken to a fenced area in the back of the property. "I escaped through a hole in the fence," he said, showing cuts and damage to his arms as evidence. The strangest thing was when I found out that the trucks coming in and out of the farm were similar to mine. I couldn't ignore it. When he wondered why he had not gone to the police, he laughed bitterly. "They will do nothing. Some even know and are in their pocket." The truth in his voice made me uneasy. On one hand, it could be just a panicked man exaggerating. On the other hand, his fear seemed too real to be dismissed. After a few minutes of silence, he asked me to drop him off at a motel in the next town. I agreed, but something inside me said his story was not over. As we drove, I noticed something strange. A dark car was following us at a constant distance. I'm not the paranoid type, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I became. When I entered the city, the car turned in another direction, but the nervousness remained. I left the guy at the motel and wished him good luck, but before he left, he held my arm and said to me, "Don't go back down that road. If they think you know something, they'll come after you too." His words stuck in my head all the way. I wanted to forget what I had heard, but at the same time I felt that I could not just ignore it. Something on that road and that farm was not right. The next day, while loading the truck for another delivery, I could not get the story of the guy out of my head. The road, the fences, the trucks, everything seemed to fit together in a disturbing way. I decided to go back to that region, but this time paying more attention. Driving down those deserted roads never bothered me before, but now it seemed that every shadow was hiding something. As I passed the section where he said he escaped, I began to notice details that had never been noticed. New plates of restricted area, an unusual movement of trucks coming and going through a discreet entrance that I always thought was from an ordinary farm. Decide to park in a distant point and watch from afar. It didn't take long to realize that something strange was happening there. The transits that came in never seemed to go out, at least not by the same way. And the few who went out had a cover that seemed heavy, as if they were carrying something that should not be seen. As I watched, the sound of branches breaking behind me, I turned quickly and saw two men dressed in dark clothes approaching. One of them was carrying something that looked like a gun. My heart shot. I have no time to think. I got in the truck and accelerated. They shouted something I couldn't understand, but I saw them going up in a truck parked ahead. It didn't take long for them to start chasing me. The roads there are narrow, full of curves, but I did my best to keep up speed. My truck wasn't made for this, and I knew that if they wanted to, they could easily reach me. It was when I saw a small dirt road that cut in another direction and decided to take a risk. I went in with everything, raising a cloud of dust that was waiting behind the guys. When I finally lost sight of them, I parked in a hidden spot and tried to catch my breath. It was clear that they did not want me around. After that scare, I decided it was time to act more carefully. I went to a gas station further away, where I knew the truckers would stop for a rest, and began to ask discreetly about that road and the truck transport. Most people would turn the subject around, but an older trucker who seemed to have seen it all left me aside and said, "You don't want to mess with that, boy. That area is owned. Powerful people." He didn't want to go into details, but made it clear that this was not new. Apparently, there have been rumors circulating for years about missing people in that region and trucks carrying mysterious loads. He is important, almost as if he did not want a rural community nearby, isolated, living as if untouched by time. "They don't like visitors," he said before returning to the truck. That really messed me up. I couldn't understand how something like this could happen so close to a road so used and nobody did anything. Decided to return to the area, but this time in a more qualified way. I waited for the dusk and went with the truck to a point where the fences of the supposed farm began. I walked for a few meters, observing every detail, until I found a trail of dirt that seemed to lead inside the property. The silence there was almost unbearable, only broken by noises of insects and occasionally by distant sound of engines. I followed the trail, hidden among the trees, until I reached a point where I could see more clearly. There was a large, illuminated shed surrounded by armed men. Outside, I saw something that made me freeze. A group of people being escorted inside, all with their hands tied and heads down. There was no more doubt about what was happening there. I stood there, hidden among the trees, not knowing what to do. The shed seemed to be the center of everything. I saw trucks parked next door with the back doors open, but I could not see what it was carrying. The armed men stood at strategic points and appeared to have security cameras scattered around the perimeter. Any wrong move could put me in danger. As I tried to decide how to get out of there, I heard a sound of footsteps coming down the track behind me. My heart popped. I hid as best I could behind a thick log, while the light of a lantern lit the way. Two men passed talking in a low voice, mentioning something about an important cargo that would be sent that night. As soon as they got away, they decided it was time to get out of there. But before I could move, I heard a scream coming from the shed, followed by a sound that sounded like a muffled shot. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that I was alone and without any recourse. I started to walk back down the trail, trying not to make noise. I arrived at the truck with my heart in my mouth and entered quickly, starting and leaving as soon as possible. While driving, my mind was spinning. What I had seen was not something that could be ignored, but I also knew that to report it was dangerous. These guys were not amateurs, and human trafficking networks are much more organized than people imagine. I went straight to a police station in a nearby town and tried to explain what I had seen. The officer who answered seemed interested at first, but when I mentioned the location and presence of armed men, his tone changed. "We have no orders in that area. I recommend you stay away from it," he said, almost as a warning. Leave the station frustrated and with the feeling that I was dealing with something much bigger. After talking to the police officer, I realized that I was alone in this. I spent the night in a cheap motel, trying to think about what to do. My head kept going back to the shed, to people being taken inside, to the children I heard. Every detail seemed to engrave in my mind, and the feeling of impotence only grew. The next morning, I made a decision. I need to gather hard evidence before I try to expose it. I returned to the region, but this time I was away from the main trail. I parked the truck in a remote point and used an old camera that I carried with me to take pictures from afar. I was able to capture some images of the trucks coming in and out and delivery around the shed. When I finally felt that I had enough material, I decided to get out of there before anyone noticed me. While driving back, with the photos stored in a USB drive in my pocket, I noticed by the rearview mirror that a car was following me. I tried to keep calm, but the car was coming closer and closer. On a deserted road, there was not much to do other than speeding and twisting to find some busy post or place. Finally, I saw a small town and went into a gas station. The car stopped at the entrance, but did not move anymore. Stayed at the post until dusk, without courage to return to the road. Since then, I have lived the feeling of being watched. The photos I took were sent anonymously to an investigative journalist, but I never heard anything about the case. I don't know what happened to the people who were there, nor with the hitchhiker who told me everything. The only certainty I have is that place, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. The face of the unnameable. I was never good at dealing with loss, but my father's death was like something inside of me had been torn out. I was 9 years old at the time, and suddenly my life turned upside down. I went to live with Laura, my stepmother, in a secluded house near a lake. It was a beautiful place, with tall trees and water that looked like a mirror on clear days. But to me, it seemed more like a prison. Laura was no more, but did not know how to deal with me. I think she was also trying to get over my father's loss, but we were two strangers trying to share the same space. I haven't spent a day without wishing I was somewhere else. She did her best to be kind, but there was something about the way she avoided talking about my father that bothered me deeply. Within the first week, I started to notice strange things at home. It was more a feeling than anything tangible. The house had a peculiar smell, something that mixed old wood with moisture, and there were spots where the floor creaked in a way that made my skin shiver. Most nights I was awake listening to the sounds of the lake, the water moving, the crickets singing, and sometimes a noise of something big moving in the water. I asked Laura if there were big fish in the lake, but she just said, "Nothing that will hurt you." Her answer seemed rehearsed, as if she was trying to convince me that it was safe, but without really believing. It was one of those nights when the wind was stronger and the sound of water seemed more intense, that I saw for the first time what would change everything. He was lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, trying to ignore the children outside. It was as if something happened moving in the water of the lake, but too big to be a fish. I took the lantern that left the side of the bed and, even with my heart pounding, I went to the window. The wind rocked the trees, and the moonlight reflected on the lake, creating strange shadows on the surface. Then I saw. Something was emerging from the water, a dark shape that at first seemed to be a log or a piece of wood. But as the thing approached the shore, he realized that it had a human form, or something trying to be human. The moonlight lit what looked like a head, but it wasn't connected to a real body. The face was my father's face. I stopped breathing for a moment, unable to look away. That was not possible. My father was dead. Closed my eyes tightly, thinking it was my imagination, but when I opened again, the creature was already on the shore, looking directly at me. His eyes were deep, as if emptied, and his skin looked wet, as if he was rotting. The light of the lantern trembled in my hand, but I could not move. It was when I heard a low sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the creature. "Isaac." My name. That was enough for me to run. Dropped the lantern on the floor and went back to bed, covering myself with the blanket as if it could protect me. I stayed up the rest of the night, shaking, trying to convince myself that it was a dream, but the image of that thing was still etched in my mind. The next morning, I tried to pretend nothing happened. Laura was in the kitchen making coffee, and she told me how I had slept. I replied with an automatic, "Well," but she found something was wrong. "You look pale, are you feeling okay?" I just shook my head, not wanting to talk about it anymore. Spending the day ignoring the feeling that something was watching me was almost unbearable. Every time I looked at the lake from the window, I felt that there was something hidden in the water, waiting. During the afternoon, Laura called me to help her clean the basement, and it was there that I found out she was also hiding something. While we moved old boxes, I saw a series of old photos of my father, all taken near the lake. In one of them, he certainly had something that looked like a mask or a wooden figure with human traces. I asked what it was, but Laura got strangely nervous and changed the subject, saying that they were just old things without importance. It only increased my curiosity. I waited until Laura was distracted and returned to the basement. I started to search for the boxes, but what he found left me even more confused. There were old newspaper clippings talking about disappearances in the area, involving all the people who had passed by the lake. One of the news reports mentioned a fisherman who saw something emerging from the water, describing a creature that seemed to be wearing someone else's face. My mind started running. That explained what I had seen the night before. Why was my father involved in all this? It was as if all the pieces were there, but I didn't know how to assemble them. I went back to my room that night and decided not to look at the lake anymore. But when I lay in bed, I heard the sound again. The same noise of something big moving in the water, only this time it seemed closer. The sound continued, closer and closer, as if something was slowly rising towards the house. Closed my eyes hard, trying to ignore it, but then I heard a different sound, as if something was scraping on the wall outside, just below the window of my room. My body froze. I picked up a flashlight by the bed, but my hands were shaking so much that it almost knocked it down. Finally, I gathered courage to stand up and walk to the window. I looked out with the lantern, and the beam of light illuminating something that made my heart almost stop. The creature was there, standing on the lakeshore, but now it was closer to the house, as if it had followed me. His form seemed even more distorted under the light, and the face, my father's face, seemed to look directly at me, with empty eyes and an expression that I could not decipher. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The creature announced his arm, as if he was pointing at me. I was still, not knowing what to do, until I heard a noise coming from the corridor. Laura was coming, and my first call was running to the door and locking it. I didn't want her to see that. Didn't know how she would react or what she knew about it all. While holding the handle, hearing his voice from the other side, soft but loaded with tension. "Isaac, is everything all right? What's going on?" I couldn't answer. When I looked back at the window, the creature was no longer there. There was only the lake, calm and silent, as if nothing had happened. I opened the door for Laura, trying to hide the panic in my face. She looked at me, and then at the window, as if she knew I had seen something. "We need to talk," she said, but there was something in her voice that made me feel like the answers would be even worse than the questions. Laura took me into the room, and I could see she was nervous. She began to speak hesitantly, as if every word was a weight that she did not want to carry. "I didn't want you to know that, Isaac, but maybe it's time." She told me that the lake had a history, something she and my father avoided talking about, but it was always there. According to Laura, decades ago, people reported seeing things coming out of the water, things that were not human but had familiar faces to attract their victims. His father knew that, she said, almost whispering. He said it was just superstition, but something changed before he left. She paused for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. He started spending a lot of time in the lake, alone, and came back different. He never told me what he saw, but he knew something was wrong. Her words made sense with everything I had seen, but they did not answer the main question. Why did the creature wear my father's face? Before I could ask, what came back? A heavy, humid noise coming from outside, followed by a drag that seemed to surround the house. Laura turned pale. "Did you lock the doors?" she said, already running to check. We followed each other, and I held a knife that I picked up in the kitchen, although I know it would not be of much help. When we looked out the window of the room, we saw the most terrifying thing of all. The creature was standing on the porch, coming straight to us. But it wasn't just that. I was surrounded by other figures, all wearing faces that I didn't recognize, but that left human ones aside. Laura began to pray softly, and suddenly everything stopped. The figures disappeared, and silence returned. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it came, but their image haunts me every night. The devourer of souls. I'm not the type to believe in local legends or stories, but after what happened in the small town of Montsambre, France, my view on what is real and what is impossible has changed forever. As a police captain, I have always dealt with brutal crimes, but the case that led us there was not like the others. It started with the disappearance of 2 children. There were no clear clues, only reports that they had been seen for the last time near a clearing in the forest surrounding the city. When we arrived, the atmosphere of the place was suffocating. Montsambre seemed one of those places that stopped in time, Empty streets, suspicious residents, and looks that bring secrets. Silence was almost worse than unanswered questions. My partner, Elizabeth, and I started the interview with locals, but the answers were always vague. It was as if no one wanted to talk about what was happening. An older woman, who seemed to be a kind of city guide, presents a legend called the Soul Eater. According to her, he was a spirit who took the form of whom people most feared or loved, attracting his victims to sacrifice. At first, we thought it was just superstition, something to avoid tourists or coincidence of disappearances. But as we went deeper into the investigation, we realized that there was something darker behind her words. They found carved marks in the trees near the forest, strange symbols that none of us recognized, and traces leading to an ancient abandoned temple. Something in the forest made the temperature seem to drop, even during the day, and the feeling that we were being watched never left me. When we get to the temple, the air seems even heavier. The place was taken by the vegetation, but it was impossible to ignore the symbols carved in the stones. Some were similar to what we saw in the trees, while others were distorted faces, almost as if they were screaming. Elizabeth took pictures while I tried to understand what it wanted. It was then that I found something that froze my blood, a circle on the ground, with dark marks that were clearly of dry blood. Around there were melted candles and small bones, scattered as if forgotten. None of us said anything, but we knew what it suggested. This discovery changed the tone of the investigation completely. We were no longer dealing with just disappearances. There was something ritualistic behind that thing, something planned and meticulous. Later, when reviewing the city's historical records in the local archive, he found that Mont Sombre had a long history of unexplained disappearances, many involving children. Most cases have never been solved. The oldest one was almost 200 years old and mentioned sacrifices to the devourer, made to ensure harvest and avoid diseases. It seemed absurd, but the details matched what we saw in the temple. As we go further, Elizabeth began to notice something strange in the reports. The data of the disappearances coincide with specific events, eclipses, full moons, and more disturbingly, religious ceremonies in the city. It was like everything was connected, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Every answer we received seemed rehearsed, and the few residents who gave us any clue ended up asking us to go away and leave things as they are. That night we returned to the temple. Something in me said we needed more answers, and Elizabeth casually, despite the obvious discomfort on her face. The forest seemed even denser, as if it swallowed us every step. When we arrived, we realized that something was different. The marks on the floor were fresher, and there was a metallic smell in the air, the same as we confirmed at the scene of violent crimes. I tried not to think the worst, but the tension was almost unbearable. As Elizabeth took more pictures, she noticed a figure in the distance among the trees. She was short and thin, with erratic movements, almost as if she was staggered. At first I thought it was a child, but when I yelled, the thing stopped abruptly and turned its head toward us. It wasn't human. At least, it didn't seem. Elizabeth saw the creature too and found out, pulling the gun. "Frank, what is it?" she whispered, but I had no answer. The thing started moving again, but this time faster and straight to us. Didn't think twice before pulling Elizabeth and running back to the car. The sound of branches breaking and heavy steps in the blows all the way. When we look at the vehicle, we enter and lock the doors. The forest was silenced again, as if nothing had happened. We sat there, panting, looking into the darkness. Whatever it wasn't a coincidence. We were dealing with something much more dangerous than we thought. We returned to the station with the evidence we have, but that night neither Elizabeth nor I could sleep. Something told me that it was only the beginning. The next morning, we were called to investigate a new crime scene. It was a house on the edge of town, and when we arrived, the smell of blood was almost unbearable. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those we saw in the temple, painted with something that seemed to be fresh blood. In the center of the main room, there was a body, or rather, what remained of it. The victim was a man who, according to residents, was investigating the same disappearances as us, but on his own. He was a local journalist who had the confidence to move where he did not go. There were deep marks on the floor, as if he had been dragged to the center of the room. The most disturbing was what was next to the body, a grotesque wooden mask, carved to look like a human face. The empty gaze of that mask seemed to follow us, as if it were a warning. Elizabeth tried to keep her cool while taking pictures, but I could see she was just as scared as I was. The villagers who gathered outside were not surprised by what had happened. In fact, they seemed almost resigned. When we asked an elderly woman about the victim, she just shook her head and said, "He went too far. The devourer does not forgive." It hit me like a punch. Until that moment, I found out the legend was just an excuse for the crimes, but now I wasn't so sure. At every step, it seemed that we were deepening into something that we could not fully understand. Before leaving home, I noticed a paper stuck under the journalist's body. I picked it up carefully and saw that it was a note written in haste. "The temple is only the beginning. Do not trust anyone." The note stayed in my head for the rest of the day. Don't trust anyone. Who would have written that? Was it the journalist himself, or someone who tried to warn him? We decided to go back to the police station to analyze the photos and try the points between the temple, the disappearances, and now this murder. While Elizabeth was reviewing the images on the computer, something caught my attention. In one of the photos of the temple, in the background, almost hidden by shadows, there was the same mask that we found at the crime scene. She was stuck in one of the walls, like a trophy, and yet when we were there at night, she was no longer there. Has anyone taken off the mask before or after wearing it in the ritual? Increasingly, it seemed that there was a hidden pattern in the actions of those responsible, but we were still far from finding out who they were. We decided to re-interview the residents, especially those who are more reluctant to talk. Among them was the priest of the small church in town, who clearly knew more than he was willing to admit. When we asked about the temple and the symbols, he was visibly tense, saying only, "There are things you should not know." That's not his business. But as he spoke, I noticed that he avoided looking me in the eyes and his hands trembled slightly. Before you could insist, he quickly entered the church and locked the door. We left there even more frustrated. With each new clue, it seemed that more questions arose. When we returned to the police station, we found a small box on my desk without forwarding. Inside it was a photo. It was my son's, gone for years, holding the same wooden mask. My blood froze. Who left that knew more about me than anyone in the city. I stood still looking at the photo, as if my brain refused to process what was selling. The image seemed recent, but that was impossible. My son had been missing for more than 5 years, and until that moment there was no clue as to what happened to him. Elizabeth saw my condition and took a picture of my hands. She was shocked too. "Frank, that doesn't make sense. How can anyone have that? Why here?" I knew it was more than a provocation. Whoever was behind this network wanted to involve me personally, forcing me to continue the investigation. But for what purpose? The feeling of being manipulated grew every minute. I decided not to say anything to the other officers. This photo was a direct message to me, and I would particularly find out what she wanted. That night, Elizabeth insisted we stay at the station, where we would at least be protected. But I knew I couldn't stand still. I took a picture and went back to the temple alone, carrying a flashlight and a gun. When I arrived, the place was different. There were candles lit inside, and the symbols on the specified walls more defined, as if they had been recently reformed. I entered slowly, trying not to make noise, and started exploring. In the center of the temple, where before there was only the circle on the ground, now there was something new. A pile of personal objects, dolls, toys, children's clothes. My heart opened when I considered one of the items. It was one of my son's shoes, the same one he wore on the day he disappeared. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me. The lantern shook in my hand as I turned slowly, and there in the shadows was someone wearing a wooden mask, standing and watching me. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The figure with the wooden mask did not move, but I felt that I was being trained, evaluated. Hold the gun tight, but my hands trembled so much I knew I wouldn't be able to use it. Who are you? My voice came out more like a suggestion than a firm question. The figure bowed his head slowly, as if trying to understand what I was saying. It was then that something even more disturbing happened. From behind the mask, a familiar voice echoed, distorted and low. "Father?" My heart shot. It was my son's voice. Or at least it seems. Whatever was there knew exactly how to disarm me. I took a step back, trying to keep my distance, but the figure advanced, slow and calculated, while repeating, "Father, why did you leave me?" My legs were broken and my knees fell. My mind struggled to process what was happening, but the terror was overwhelming. The figure stopped a few meters from me, still with the mask covering his face, and of course something that looked like a small wooden box. Before she could react, she opened up, and a horrible sound, like screams mixed with lamentation, filled the temple. My ears were closed, but the sound seemed to be inside my head. Everything went dark for a few seconds, and when I regained consciousness, the figure had disappeared. The temple was empty again, but the pile of objects remained there, like my son's shoe right on top. Returned to the station in a state of shock, unable to explain what happened. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was real or a manipulation to break me. The only certainty I have is that the legend of Soul Eater is not just a legend, and he's still waiting. And in the end, maybe some stories really don't have clear answers. What I witnessed that night continues to haunt me, and what I have learned is that sometimes the mysteries we encounter can be as deep as our own fears. The truth is that no matter how much I try to forget, there are things we just can't leave behind.